Ahoy! This is a Flail guide for my heavy Flail build with Great Axe Offhand usually, but that varies depending on what exactly I'm going for. And this is the main build I've been running in PvP. I mainly use it in small scale PvP, mostly arenas, but it's also usable in mid-size PvP like OPR or influence races. For war, I would recommend completely different builds because war playstyles in general are different. You need to focus on other things. The first thing that we're looking at here is a very surface level look at the skill tree. I will not go into detail about this because I've already made a video specifically for that yesterday, which I will link right here. If you want to learn all the details about why the points are where they are and where the benefits are, that's the video for you. Here's just a screenshot if you want to copy one of the generic options and jump right in. Here's a quick overview of my build, nothing special, I just have the necessary perks and some okay perks along with that. So we have Fortifying Whirlwind here. I really think that if you're using Whirlwind this is necessary, otherwise it's definitely not, but if you have a Graph-Well then you want to have Insatiable Graph-Well instead. I'm running Void Darkplate, but there are other options. I'm running Crusading Purpose here, but that is probably something I'm going to replace. I just wanted to have some shirking heals, but since I'm not fully refreshing capped at the moment, I probably don't want Ref Ward. Then I have these leg pieces here, which just have some elemental aversion, thrust conditioning, health. And we have the Woodgrain shoes, which I crafted with health, elemental aversion, and crippling reap. Crippling reap some people like to use on their weapon instead, because the value does get amped up a lot. I like to have that on my armor and have the refreshing charge on my weapon instead, but that's preference. Nothing unusual in the jewellery, this needs to be replaced for sure, I need to get some better absorption there. I am using Champion's Ring, again this gets upscaled as usual in arenas and stuff, and I have an SLOTH crystal earring, but nothing good here, I would just upgrade that in general. I don't like most artifacts that much though, so I'm probably not looking to replace anything in that regard. For the shield, I've talked about this before, but I think this is very nice. You have counter attack, which also procs on your offhand, and you have refreshing, which is also available on both of your gear pieces. The refreshing move only works on the flail, and in my opinion is probably not that good because I'm not really attacking that much with the flail with basic attacks, so I'll probably replace that. With this patch we can now get Enchanted Ward, so if that was the third perk I would get, that would be great. Otherwise, a nice perk here could also be Accelerating Barrage. I currently don't have that, and I think that could be a decent one to have on your shield as well. It doesn't get the high scaling from the weapon when you put it on the shield, but I think it's a very good effect to have. This needs to be a kite shield in order to get the stagger. My flail is the budget biz option, so to speak. In this case you have an opal, lightning on it here because it was cheap. You want to have a dot with the loadout that I'm using, so you want to have Rune Glass whenever possible. I have Plagued Strikes, Burning Smite, that's self-explanatory, you want to increase the cooldown of enemies, and Flame Attunement is locked on Cleansing Whip, but I think it's pretty nice to have, it's just a nice amount of extra damage. Otherwise you could go for a Trenchant or Rend here and even more debuffs on the enemy. The reason we're using Plagued Strikes and not Plagued Crits is because they actually stack. And what you can do is you can use Trip and use the follow-up heavy attack, and you get a guaranteed proc of Plagued Strikes. And then you switch to your other weapon, in my case that is this Great Axe, which I actually bought today, which has Plagued Crits. And I have my Refreshing Charge here and my Vicious, so overall a good all-rounder that does exactly what I want to do. I switch over, I have an Emerald on this as well, so I deal more damage once they are lower, and I have a different type of dot on it. So everything just kind of working together between those two weapons. Of course, if you are not planning to use a Plague Crits secondary or main hand, whatever you want to call it, then you can put Plague Crits on the Flail instead as well, and you will very likely proc it most of the time. If you enjoyed the video so far, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you get notified of other upcoming videos, and if you'd like to support me further, you can do so on Patreon. This is my current attribute split. You can see I have 350 strength. This is so I can get the final capstone here, guaranteed, and then if I want to and I want to go into more damage, I can always use buff food with strength and get to nearly 400. I use 50 intelligence because I definitely want to have the backstab and crit damage, and at that point it's only 25 extra points to get the 5% base damage increase to targets affected by a dot, which they always will be because I have double Rune Glass and various dot effects from the flail. So I think this is worth using. I don't think you get more damage out of getting 25 more strength at this point, and that's the mix scaling between the two. You can of course also run focus if you want to have the additional ability cooldown reduction, that's absolutely possible too. You can even go up to the incoming healing if you're running with someone who's healing you. I have done this for a bit, personally I prefer having more damage, being more of a threat, so I can really compete in terms of overall damage output. I found that even in the beginning when people were still running medium and I was running heavy, I was able to keep up with them in damage with this build by running int. And for Constitution we're running 152, so if we need to we can get to 200 with buff food, and otherwise we can stick to 152 and worry about other things instead, which I think is also beneficial depending on the situation. We can of course also flex around here and say we use focus food instead, and then that way we can also get the split here that allows us to still get these perks here all together while sitting at 350 strength. When it comes to combos and overall playstyle, the Flail is very forgiving and adaptable, but there are a few things that you want to pay attention to. At the beginning of a fight, especially when facing ranged players, I will often use Barrage as an engage relatively early on. This allows me to block all incoming projectiles with bulldoze and kinda get to the enemy without taking pretty much any damage, and also have counterattack enabled, and it also sets me up for the leap at the end of it so they get staggered if I land on them with the attack. But of course, when you're a bit further away, you can also just block a couple of attacks while getting close enough for Barrage. I don't always use this because sometimes I want to have Barrage up later. This especially depends on how clumped the enemies are. The more clumped they are, the more likely it is that I'm going to hit at least someone with Barrage, or maybe multiple people with the follow-ups. So then I definitely use Barrage to engage. And it also depends on how much range damage is coming my way. If I'm in arena and there are 3 melees, then I will probably not use Barrage immediately. When getting staggered, many players will intuitively dodge, so you kind of have to time things here a little bit, but the timing here also fairly forgiving. Your follow-up to Barrage is typically going to be Arcane Smite, which gives you another stagger on the enemy, which also applies various debuffs. And then right after that, I usually follow with Trip, because you can somewhat guarantee the smite into the Trip. Depends a little bit on how far away the enemy is though. Trip's range is surprisingly longer than it looks, but if they're at the very edge of Arcane Smite when you're hitting them, then it may not end up being ideal. You really want to focus on trying to land Trip, because it's such an important ability for debuffing and for setting up, that without it you lose a lot of the value of the build, or if you miss it, you lose a lot of value of the build. It is worth keeping in mind that we are running Burning Smite though, which means if the enemies are not really using abilities at the start of the fight and are just safely poking, then it can sometimes be worth stalling your combo a little bit. Sometimes it's better to just maybe use Barrage and then switch to your other weapon, attack a little bit, see what the enemy does, and see if you can bait something out, and then go in with the Burning Smite to increase their cooldowns after they've used their abilities. In either scenario, once your Trip has landed and the follow-up attack, the heavy attack from Destabilize, has landed, you want to switch to your other weapon. You've now applied all of the debuffs that you have available on the Flail, and then some pretty much from the weapon effects, from the heavy attack effects that you have on your weapon. So you want to switch over and now utilize all of that setup and all of that debuffing to do as much damage as possible without taking much damage in return. That is why I like running the Great Axe here. Not only does it come with good damage, but also it can follow up the CC even further, which makes this even more annoying. I often switch over and go straight into Reap. While I could get some more DPS out of cancelling here, this means I have a much higher chance of confirming the Reap, especially if they try to roll out right after the Trip. They roll away and then get pulled back in immediately. And then I get the free follow-up attack on that as well, and I get the applied slow from Crippling Reap. At this point, between all the staggers and pulls, many people have blown a lot of their escapes already, and their escape potential in general should be quite low. But if they're able to get away, then you can now still follow up with a charge. You obviously want to right-click cancel that, so you get the cooldown reduction on that, so you can use it very frequently as well. And if that fails, you still have the option to go for Whirlwind. Whirlwind is fantastic at sticking to enemies. With a light attack cancel into Whirlwind, you can kind of just follow along and you don't really lose movement speed the same way you would if you were just left clicking then, and a lot of enemies are not expecting it because it's such an underused ability. So it's very effective for that, and it's also very effective when the enemies are clumped up. If you're running Graph-Well, then you can also either use this to lock a target down even further, or you can use this earlier on to open, for example, after Barrage, if you have multiple enemies around. When it comes to other offhand weapon choices, you are quite flexible. You can run Blunderbuss, potentially with some more int, unless you're switching between Great Axe and Blunderbuss and you probably don't want to change spec every time. You can possibly run Warhammer, even though I think that is generally weaker in many situations. You can also absolutely run Sword and Shield, because it just gives you decent amount of extra damage and also even more survivability. and other possibilities would be spear grade sort of hatchet, for example, but I haven't really used those and I probably wouldn't prioritize them. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like. In the next days we'll be talking about the rapier guide as well. If you'd like to support me further and get early trading tips, then consider doing so on Patreon. Thanks to all my patrons who I do exactly that. And thank you for watching. SLOTH out.